So welcome to this this session about policy, how to make economic research on conflict policy relevant. So as you all know, policy relevance is really in the DNA of CEPR, and part of the context of this session is that CEPR is hosting a new research initiative called Recipe, which is focused on understanding conflict, in particular in developing countries, and trying to promote research to identify policies that can help to mitigate and reduce conflict. So this will be a grant-giving program with the first calls starting early 2025. There will be PhD grants, small grants, large grants. If you're interested, there's a link to the website here. And I'm kind of involved in this program as being responsible for engagement, which means that I'm kind of trying to interact with policymakers and get their inputs on what we should focus on, and then disseminate results. And in that capacity, I've had over the last couple of months lots of meetings with policymakers who are all very interested in kind of the work we are doing. But at the same time, in these discussions, there's often a set of perhaps more fundamental questions about what exactly the scope is for economic research on conflict and its ability, like how we can improve the impact and the relevance of the work we do. And so the goal of this panel is really to get to some of these more fundamental questions. And I'm really excited about the distinguished panelists that we were able to collect for this debate. So starting on the right, left for you guys, there is Sarah Spencer Bernard, who is working at the OECD in the INCAV group. So that's the International Network on Conflict and Fragility. And then there's Hannes Mueller from the Institute of Economic Analysis, and Michele de Maio, who is a professor in the University of Sapienza of Rome. And I think we'll start this debate by, perhaps each of us can explain very briefly, like how in their own work they have interacted with policymakers, and they've kind of been experienced this link between policy and academic research on conflict. And then we'll get to a set of more, as I said earlier, fundamental questions about the scope of the work we do and its ability to influence policy. So perhaps we can start with Sarah.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So as you mentioned, I'm from the OECD, the unit that looks at conflict, crisis, and fragility. And our job is basically to provide research, analysis, and ultimately policy advice to our member governments. So we interact on a daily basis, and we are sort of the sort of upstream to the policy decisions which are made in OECD member capitals. So where this interacts and the reason for us being part of this conversation is obviously there has been a huge amount of progress, and you will know all better than I. I am not an economist. Can I just put that disclaimer out there to start with? I think I'm probably a rare beast in this room and not being an economist, but I think that also can bring quite a fresh perspective. So, economic research, the understanding of economic and development economics has come a huge, really, really long way in the last, let's say, 100 years, and we can really see the changes that have evolved over time. But we also see that there's that space around fragility and conflict, which has kind of become the final frontier where we haven't quite cracked it yet. And so what we are interested in is where the economic research informs policy making in this space, but at the same time where the research and the analysis of fragility and conflict itself can inform economic policy making. So it goes in both directions, and I think that's something that that we want to sort of focus on, and why we see value in this work that you're taking forward with Recipe. Our analysis at the moment shows that there's increasing fragility globally, but there's also an increasing diversity of economic profiles in contexts affected by high and extreme fragility. And that diversity is driven by fragility in other dimensions which are not economic. So the interactions between all the different dimensions of fragility are really fundamental to understanding what good policy looks like. And then I think, obviously, the importance of evidence-based policymaking. I think it's personally more true today than it's ever been, at a time when, you know, experts are not always the most welcome people in the room. But then also the reality of policymaking being a place where you have to basically be ready to make the second, third, fourth best options and turn that into policy, rather than being in a best case scenario which we don't always have the luxury of doing. So that's just in a nutshell where I'm coming from. Okay,
great. Then Hans?
So yeah, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. I think the genesis of my kind of exposure to policymakers is an academic work in forecasting, which we published in the APSR, then in JEA. And then there was a grant during COVID time, which we had to travel, and we decided to convert that traveling grant into a webpage. So we kind of said, hey, we cannot travel, can we just instead make a webpage? And so we made this webpage that's called conflictforecast.org. And it was a huge pain. I mean, I completely underestimated what it takes to take an academic project that does forecasting and proves that it works into something that can be updated monthly. It was a complete nightmare in terms of like effort. Extra effort was, I would say, twice writing the paper, kind of like effort in terms of putting it out there and getting something that can actually be used. But then the response was completely crazy. It completely blew me away. We had like people knocking our door, and you know, from then on, I'd never looked back. So now I've been completely perverted, I would say, into the policy space. So we work with 2 foreign offices. We work with the World Bank. We work with the IMF. We work with now several UN organizations. Now we just put out a policy report that's out there on the use of AI in humanitarian work and how that can improve decision making. And so we're taking this academic work package and like have now completely moved onto the policy side. But I think it's very interesting to think about the backflow of ideas from once you are facing the problems that people are facing on the ground or when they are making decisions, to kind of like what is an interesting academic question, right? Because obviously I still want to publish, so you know I'm trying to pick like what's in here that is still publishable, and that's super rewarding. I think that's a process that I like a lot, and I'm obviously happy to talk about that later when times arrive.
Great, Michele?
Okay, so thank you again for inviting me and for you for being here. So I'm exactly on the opposite of the spectrum, in the sense that my experience with policymakers is zero. It's completely absent, and this is why I think this is interesting in the sense for me, because I had to think why I was so unable to have any connection with any political entity. And at the same time, I mean, I was very disappointed by this while I was working, because I mean, when I decided to be a development economist, my idea was, okay, I would try to do something to learn about this world and to make it less bad as it is. And then at the end of the day, I realized that there is I had no ability to make what I studied to be in any level relevant for the policy debate. On my, I mean, to not feel too bad, I have to say also that I see very little interest, at least in the context of Italy, for instance, from the political sphere to be informed about not only my research or in general research on conflict, but in general there is not very much interest in trying to understand a bit more contexts which are not the Italian economy and so on. So there is a bit of two. So for sure we should discuss how, in particular me, can be better in conveying these messages, but at the same time one should understand which are the incentives that institutional politicians in general may have to learn a bit more about what we do and what we learn from our studies. So, sorry about that.
Okay, no, that's great, and I think we're all here in this panel to learn. Me probably more than anyone else. I think to kind of kick off the debate, like the kind of one topic that I would like to propose as almost a framing question. It comes from the fact that as soon as you start talking to policymakers about conflict issue, the kind of the key concept that they have in mind when they think about these topics is fragility. And interesting, fragility is almost absent from the economic literature on conflict. It's not a word we use in our papers. I've written like at least like 7 or 8 conflict papers, and I don't think I've used the word fragility even once. So the first question I would like to propose to this panel is like how do we think about the distinction between fragility and observable conflict, and how is that distinction relevant for the policy advice that we give? And I think the first person I would like to ask this question to is Sarah, because she's involved in the kind of the leading publication on this topic, which is the States of Fragility report by the OECD. So Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. So I will actually start by talking about fragility, because that's actually the starting point that our analysis goes from. So we at the OECD define or understand fragility as an imbalance between exposure to risks and coping capacities to manage, deal, and mitigate those risks. And this is not just at the state level, this is communities, societies, systems. And we look at it across 6 dimensions. So the economic dimension is one of those 6, but we also have a political dimension, societal dimension, security, environmental and human dimensions on top of the economic one. So it's really this multi-dimensional phenomenon, and as I was saying in the introduction, the economic fragility that we see in contexts exposed to high and extreme fragility is shaped by those other dimensions as well. So it's very difficult to isolate it and look at it on its own. So it's an analytical framework that we've developed, and actually we have an open source website where you can see we have a statistical model and a framework with a number of, I think, 57 indicators across the 6 dimensions that we use to assess and measure, in a way, fragility across currently 177 contexts where we have enough data, because we do have a data threshold, of course. And that gives us a breakdown across those 177 of the levels of fragility. So we do also believe that it's a universal phenomenon, so we kind of step away from the whole labeling, this is a fragile state, this is not. That's not something that we think is particularly helpful. And OECD members, France, for example, will have a certain degree of fragility across the 6 dimensions, but also will have quite strong coping capacities and resilience to deal with that. So it's an analytical framework that helps us to better understand the connections between issues, between trends, and between policy instruments, which obviously when you're advising on policy decisions is really what we're trying to get at. What we also see is that fragility is not the sort of simplistic assumption that fragility means low income, least developed. That's a misnomer. What we know from our analysis is that more than half of the contexts which in our framework are sort of in the high and extreme fragility space are actually middle income countries. So we're not talking about just low income and least developed countries. Some of them are conflict affected, not all, and there is an important distinction. I think that's the point you wanted to get to. They're overlapping, but they are distinct. Fragility, obviously, social, economic, environmental, can drive conflict and result in conflict, but vice versa, conflict can drive fragility by the destruction of social systems, infrastructure, economic infrastructure, etc. So there is a strong interaction, but they are different. And just to take a very concrete example, in our framework, Ukraine, at this stage, does not appear in the high and extreme fragility space. Why? Because actually it is in conflict, and it is obviously extremely exposed, but it also has a huge amount of resilience and ability to cope with the exposure to the risk that it sees at the moment. So I think it's a useful example to distinguish, to understand the distinction between the two concepts.
Yeah, I think that is great, and I'm sure that Hannes will want to add to this, because I think like very naturally from like the example you gave, there is this question of like, you know, how can we actually predict conflict and like, you know, try to get a sense of, among a set of countries that are fragile in different dimensions, which ones are most likely to experience actual conflict, and that's exactly the forecasting question.
No, I think that, first of all, I think that's super interesting, you know, knowing a little bit the policy debate. The way you use the word risk, right, is slightly different than like most economists would use the word risk. That's very interesting, by the way. This, like, these words already have so much load, they're so loaded, right? The risks can be basically already exposures, I would say. Like, it's not in the future and a probability, but it's like something that is actually happening, right? You have an economic shock that is a risk, right, so I think that these things are interesting. Over the years, for me, of course, I come from forecasting, so I've very self-servingly, I've always defined fragility as something that is in the future, right? If you think about the vase that is on the table and you wonder whether the vase is fragile, there's a way to look at it and say, like, what are the structure, what is the kind of like, how is it made of, right? Is it glass or is it metal? The other way is like to throw it on the floor and see if it breaks. Right? And if it breaks, it was fragile. And I think that very often we have this kind of built-in systems, the way they measure things are like exposed driven, right? They're not forecasting explicitly. And so this is something we have really kind of tried to push a lot, like with policymakers, with the German Foreign Office, we tried to convince them, like, hey, you need to really move away from like just like doing indices and like just like aggregating across. You need to do forecasting, right? And I think that's very interesting to see this contrast. Like, is it something that is explicitly forward-looking, or is it something that is kind of like exposed defining, right? And of course, that has a huge impact on policy response, because if you have a measurement that is exposed reacting, then your policy response is always going to come late. It's never going to prevent anything, because it's always like you see something becomes fragile the moment it's on the floor and already broken. And I think the good news is that the OECD index, we tried these things, or we say, look, for example, is the OECD security category predicting? And it is, right? So that's because I think you guys are having things inside this index that is kind of like the coping, for example, the coping part is like these things will not break the moment you throw it on the floor, right? But for example, the World Bank's list, I've been attacking this list for like with passion for years now. It is completely reactive. So the World Bank and the IMF are completely defining fragility exposed. There's no indicators. If you move away from the conflict affected, which is obviously, right, it's conflict affected, it's on the floor, right, and not conflict affected, it might be fragile. If you take that part of the list that is not conflict affected, the probability, the spread of the probability likelihood is completely flat. It's like a uniform distribution across all countries, which is obviously not a great forecast. And so kind of like, they know that, right? So the World Bank's now redesigning the entire system to get a better list and to have a better policy response. And I think that's great news. But I will stop here. I think that for me, it's like fragility is a forward-looking thing, whereas conflict affected is a definition while you see it and it's having conflict right now.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I think that's extremely interesting, and you alluded earlier to the fact that like you were surprised by the extent to which the forecasting work that you do is being picked up by different actors, and I want to use that in some sense to introduce like perhaps a broader question, which is like, you know, to which extent do we think that the priorities that we have as an academic kind of group and as a group of economists working on conflict, to which extent do our priorities map into the priorities of policymakers? And I think that like forecasting is one area where clearly we are not putting kind of efforts that are commensurate with the demand of policymakers. But even more broadly, like where would you say that there are areas that are currently understudied in the work we do? And I want to give the floor to Michele for this.
Okay. Yeah, so it's obviously difficult to answer because I mean, the knowledge of all the works that have been done in this topic, it's always limited by my capabilities. I obviously try to focus on 3 things that I think could be said are still need a lot of work. One is something which may seems very easy and obvious, which is the macroeconomic impacts of conflict. So I think that we still need to learn a bit more of economics of the conflict. So how conflict affects the behavior of firms, for instance. They not exact. I mean, obviously, we may imagine that there is a negative impact. Okay, this is something that is not surprising anyone in the room. But the challenge could be try to understand exactly what happens. So how firms adjust to conflict, because what you see it's in fact that firms survive. The large majority of firms survive during conflict. So there are ways in which they adjust to the new context, to the new situation, and so understanding whether this comes from changing the supplier or maybe changing the arrangement in the labor market. I mean, all the things that we study in economics that affect the behavior of firms are somehow also impacted by conflict. So it would be, we don't know if there is a general pattern. This is very, very much context dependent. So there are a lot of things that still can be learned about. And I say this because I've done similar studies in different countries and results are very different. So it depends on the context, on the conflict, on the type of firms that are in these countries, how they react to the conflict situation. So this is something that I find interesting and goes in the direction of saying that there is a lot of heterogeneity. And so this is a challenge also for the political, let's say, counterpart, because every time they want to understand more, then probably the first point will be, okay, which type of context are we talking about? If there is any general pattern, it's difficult to understand. But still, I think that adding knowledge on this maybe at some point get us to a general view on the impacts, which is not obvious, again. And it's not obvious also because you may think about the fact that there can be part of the economy can take advantage of the situation induced by conflict, again, depending on the type of conflict, but we may imagine that there are some sectors that are less negatively impacted or even can gain from conflict and so on. So this is one big part of the things that I think would be interesting to go into more detail. The other thing is, in general, the way in which the conflict will change the way in which the economy is managed. It was suggested before also. I mean, I think we are entering an area in which conflict will be, unfortunately, part of the economic decision and the political decision in general. So understanding how that may impact on the decision on public spending or the way in which some incentives will be distributed across firms and in general in the economy would be interesting. The huge black box of the military spending and the defense industry. This was something that was a lot studied, for instance, in the 70s. There is a long tradition, and then we had a period in which this disappeared. And now I think we are coming back again to understand how, for instance, the change in the military spending will affect the firms, will affect the labor market in general, will affect structural change. I mean, there are a lot of elements that purely economic elements. I'm going a bit in the other direction, but and finally, the last one is that to me, conflict is a situation. Okay, so it's again a label that I used to somehow wrongly, but attribute to different settings. Okay, and in this sense, also some type of policies like sanctions or changes in the way in which the normal way of operating firms and the economy should be part of this research agenda, because they are very different from other types of economic decisions, purely economic. So I think it will be interesting to understand how the economy adjusts to these different type of constraints that are not purely economic but are policy driven somehow, or politically driven, as we may say. So this is my very narrow perspective on this, but I think these are 3 aspects that are interesting to be explored more.
Hannes or Sarah, do you want to add to that, or? I think
Just to say, I think building on what you're saying, particularly on your final point around the sort of conflict economies that can develop with bits of the economy reacting differently, being probably quite resilient and healthy. And then the impact of sanctions and things is also really important in view of being able to build peace. So if you're thinking conflict, at some point you want to also think about what happens, hopefully to get towards a resolution of conflict and towards a post-conflict transition and towards peace. So without having that full understanding of what the situation is during the conflict, it's very difficult to see how you can build pathways towards peaceful settlements which take into account the economic dimension, the political economy, the elite captures, all the conflict economy that needs to be transformed towards a peace economy. So I think just reinforcing that point, really.
Okay, I think I would like to go a bit deeper into one thing you mentioned, like when you kind of identified this first research priority about the impact on firms. You mentioned that, like, you know, there's a huge amount of heterogeneity when we study conflict, and I think that's actually a broader question that comes up whenever we work as economists on this topic. That, like, the external validity of the work we do is often a lot harder to, like, pin down than when we are studying a labor, like a generic labor market. And I guess like one of the questions I have is what we can actually do as researchers to help translating the findings that we present, which are often based on a specific context, and to make them relevant to other contexts, which is something that we actually rarely do in our papers, but that is hugely important if we want to, like, reach policymakers and have impact on how they think and what they do.
Should I try to answer?
Yeah, you can, of course.
No, my only point on this is that I think that part of the inability that we have to generalize is because we know too little about the single cases. So especially this literature that I know a little more, which is about the impact on firms, there are very few papers. There are few, so it's difficult to say that this is gonna, even if you find heterogeneities, then it's difficult to generalize. But if you add more, even single cases or specific cases, and then we can try to think about what is making these impacts similar across contexts. So this is why I encourage this type of attempts to find heterogeneities to then reconcile in a more general setting. But we need more understanding of, otherwise we have one example or another one, and then we have two different cases. So there is one in which the effect of conflict affects more firms that are more exposed to international trade, as I found in Libya, and then you have another one in which in Palestine it's the opposite case. So which one is the more relevant, I don't know, because I have only two examples. So if we had like 15 cases or studies, then maybe you can, okay, that was a very special one, and most of the cases is the one, the other that matters. I don't know, this is why.
So essentially you're telling us that we should shut up, like, and not talk about the policy impact of our work until we've accumulated a body of evidence.
No, I'm saying that.
But I think that I always explain to my students that the way we learn from data, right, is that if you have no data, then you should do theory, right? Then you first sort out your mind. And the more data you have, the more data-driven you can become, right? So if you have two data points, then you need theory to kind of connect these data points and say what was different in this situation rather than that one. But I think, I don't know, I mean, I'm sure that's your experience as well. Like the moment you are in a meeting with a policymaker, they will ask you very specific things about very specific cases, and very often I throw my hands up in the air and I say, like, look, I don't know why. I mean, this is, I don't know. So it's very frustrating, I think, for both sides. The academic side and the policy side, these meetings become very quickly very frustrating because you're like, okay, I don't know what the incentives of this armed group in this circumstance is, and I think it's also not very honest to pretend that right? So I think that there is clear scope for, I think the OECD is exactly, you're in this space where you talk to both sides and you build expertise and like building that bridge, right? And I think you can read academic papers, but you can also talk to them. I think that's exactly where institutions like that are fundamental. Like there's no way I can translate all my research to policymakers. That said, I think there's also something about heterogeneous treatment effects, which is very interesting, I find, right? Where you have well-identified causal papers that are trying harder to have in the back of the paper some like, this is obviously our point estimate is like this, but it could go from here to here, right? And I think then understanding of where are you in this particular case is an interesting question. I think we're not always ready enough to engage with that very seriously. And I think that's on our side. I think that could be done more, where we talk be a bit more humble and say, oh, it's not a point estimate. It is about like putting out the cases there, be honest about outliers, say like this is where all the stuff doesn't work, right? And the case, I think we already have all the data, so we can look at that. We can look at that more seriously. On a very nerdy side point, I just want to say that again because I'm the forecasting guy. I think it's also interesting to think about this duality between causal work and forecasting work, where heterogeneous treatment effects is basically a forecasting model that you run at the end of your causal inference, right? Whereas what I do is usually forecasting and then thinking about what would be the policy response to this forecasted case. So we are like saying, watch out, Congo. Then they ask me what should we watch out for, and I have no answer because as opposed to your forecast, your fragility measurement has causal. You are making causal statements inside. We are not, right? We're purely forecasting, and then we have nothing to say. Then we're like, whatever you think is right for Congo, do it, right? And I think that's kind of like where then you would need causal work to then say, we have studied similar cases and you should do this, and that, right? So it's like sometimes you do kind of machine learning, forecasting first, and then the other thing or you do well-identified causal work and then you do forecasting at the very end for heterogeneous treatment effects. I think it's very interesting to have this duality between these two things.
And Sarah, perhaps like from your perspective, is there more we can do to make our research relevant?
So a couple of thoughts. One is actually quite quote unquote basic, if I may, and you mentioned it very clearly when we were talking about risk. I mean, language matters hugely, and I'm not an academic, but I am able to read academic papers and I'm familiar with the language and I understand the concepts. That is not necessarily always the case. And we do the same in the policy making spaces. You know, we have our own acronyms and language and concepts and fantastic jargon. And I think a lot can be done to just try and think through how do we translate the results of the academic research into language that policymakers, not even talking about politicians, I'm really talking about more the policymakers at this stage, because talking to a political level is a whole different ballgame that even we struggle with. But so I think that's one point which I think has a lot of potential. And then on the point of, you know, having a limited evidence base and very context specific, I think one of the things that we know in development work, for instance, international development work, is that context does matter, and everything is context specific. But building an evidence base across a range of contexts, as you were suggesting, does allow you to start looking at trends and picking up trends and seeing where perhaps there are links that you can draw out and parallels, but you can also see where things haven't worked and things haven't worked out the way you expected them to, which is also valuable lessons to learn and to not apply in policy, if I may. And then the third thing I would say specifically, because we're talking about conflict, is that one of the huge challenges that we see is that when you're in a context affected by conflict, data becomes rarer and rarer and rarer to find, and really difficult to study anything once that data is no longer being produced, whether it's, you know, at the sort of household level, or whether it's at the firm level, or whether it's at the level of a central bureau, a statistics bureau. So, you know, an example at the moment is West Bank and Gaza. We have data on Gaza up to 2023. And there's a black hole since. So now we can still work, because our work is based on data which is already available. So our work is slightly looking back a bit rather than forecasting. But we can still do that. But I don't know, and I'm not confident that in a couple of years' time we'll be able to give you a good analysis of that particular context, because we won't have the ability to see what's happening. So that the challenge here for policymakers is also to see how do you put in place policies that actually allow you to generate and have the data available to be able to then study what's actually happening. But yeah.
We actually have a question in the audience, which I mean, I should have said this up front, but of course, you're all invited to ask questions. I think, yeah, like Christine, yeah, please go for it.
No, I was just wondering, I mean, since you now mentioned Gaza, but I'm wondering, I mean, given the 14+ months that we've seen where governments are not abiding to international law, and whether our job as economists should not also be to speak out for justice and for international law. So we're talking a lot about research, and I think that's important. But our governments have been complicit in atrocity crime. So this, I mean, here this discussion is very kind of positive in the sense that we have this dialogue, but I think there's this tension, right? So, I mean, we want to give advice. We often need the government to provide data. We see that in Germany, there's a lot of talk about evidence-based data. But by that, kind of, there's a lot of collaboration, and it's also difficult then to kind of take a stance and step back and say, okay, maybe I don't get the data anymore, but like we should really speak out as economists, as scholars. We see what is happening. We don't have good data, but I think we have enough data, and there's enough evidence that we know that kind of atrocity crimes and genocide is being committed, and we have been pretty much silent. And I'm wondering whether our job as scholars, as economists, should not also be, besides the research that we do to do important policy, but also in cases where there's a breach of international law, to actually speak out more than we've done in the past. So I just wanted to bring this up because CEPR is also a lot about policy, but I think now that kind of the world is changing and not for the best in that sense, whether our duty as a scholar is also to do very fundamental work in a sense as well.
Hannes?
So yeah, I have personally, I think it's a personal decision, by the way. I don't think there's a general advice on this, and I think that very different academics react very differently to this problem. I need to say that I think if you study conflict worldwide, right, then there is so many very, very, very bad situations around the world that I don't know, kind of like pick your country, right? I think that I think it's terrible. I think, you know, South Sudan is a completely abysmal situation. So I think that, you know, if you work on this conflict space, the moment you look at any case, that it becomes, you know, terrible. I think that we are very bad in general in a society to react to these things because they're very media driven, right? So my favorite example is the Syrian refugee crisis, where the West kind of reacted when we saw this boy lying on the beach. I don't know whether you remember this picture, right? It was like thousands of kids had crossed deserts, had drowned in the Mediterranean Sea by that point. And then at a sudden, I was told by policymakers in the United Nations that were responsible for this, for humanitarian response, that they got a lot more money after this picture was published, right? So that the mobilization of resources to deal with this problem was like way late, like super late. And so I think that we are all complicit in this kind of negligence. And so I gave a presentation once that was kind of trying to frame this fragility thing. I was like saying, like, look at here, like India, I had in India as an example at that moment, because there was this kind of Hindu nationalism kind of becoming more and more extreme. I was like, look, if this blows up, we will not talk about anything for the next decades. If India goes into civil war, right, this will be like a complete meltdown, right? And so like trying to do prevention, like early prevention, not like it's already broken. And I had a person there in the audience who was Indian. He said, like, Modi doesn't give a damn about what you're saying, right? He doesn't care about your prediction and so on. And I thought, wow, this is really, so you need to become a lot more activist than just to even like do applied work and so on. You need to really like, you need to make an effort to go into the media, and you know, and I think I wasn't ready at that point to, and I think I'm still not ready at that point to kind of home down on one problem and one, because I think that that's not my place. But I think that, you know, if your research is relevant for something specific, then I think it's to engage with that in a certain way, I think is a good thing.
Okay.
Two questions, and I try to keep them short. The first is on fragility, which I think is a very interesting concept that we as economists don't use. Years ago, I read this book, Anti-Fragility by Nassim Taleb, where, as I remember, two key concepts were the non-linearity, but also that something could be anti-fragile, so become like maybe Ukraine stronger from external shocks. That's my first question. The second is, another interesting book I read was Chris Blackman's Why We Fight, where it emphasizes in particular that most conflicts don't take place, so we don't observe them in our data. But if we talk about investing in peace, should we investigate more how conflicts are avoided without actually us normally observing them in our normal conflict data?
I don't know. I think these are great questions, actually. Like perhaps on fragility.
Do you want me
like,
to yeah. So maybe I'll start with the second one with Chris Blackman's book, and it is a really enlightening read, because it is true that most conflicts don't take place, and so what we're trying to do also now with the framework that we've developed to understand and analyze fragility is to see how we can use it, because it's multidimensional and because it sort of gives you the bigger picture, to try and identify. So we're not in the prediction space, but we're trying to see how you can use it to inform what we would call in the development space upstream prevention work. So how do you prevent, how do you use that analysis, to understand where your entry points are, to support pockets of resilience, to support coping capacities, to reinforce what the systems which are working to try and prevent conflict further downstream. So I think, and then by extension, investing in peace. So that's something that we hope that we will have featuring quite centrally in the States of Fragility, which will be published in February. And it's a case that we want to make because the prevention argument has kind of got stuck in a circular, how can you prove something that hasn't happened, and what's the counterfactual? And so we're trying to break that cycle of, going around in circles and saying, well, actually, if you take that an analytical framework, maybe it can actually give you some entry points. So that's on this conflict that doesn't happen. It's specifically on fragility, but I think probably the same argument is valid on conflict. And then on the anti-fragility non-linearity, and can conflict maybe make some contexts more resilient in some ways? Is that what you're getting at?
To be honest, I think the non-linearity aspect is probably more important. I'm not sure there are many anti-fragile states.
So on the non-linearity, I haven't read that specific piece of work, but my initial reaction would be to say that for us, fragility, as I was explaining, it's multidimensional. So by default, it's not linear. And so it's not a space where you can see development going from, sort of development improving massively and fragility decrease. It's not a sort of, there's not a direct correlation. I think the other thing that's important to underline is that stability, so stagnation or stability is not necessarily development. So when you've got a fragile situation and it's just sort of still there, and sort of what we call chronic fragility, that's not the same thing as development. And then in terms of non-linearity, if you look at it as a multidimensional phenomenon, then by definition you're looking at, it's a systems thinking piece where you're trying to make the connections across systems and across dimensions. So there is no going from A to B. What we do see, however, and I'm thinking about the extreme fragility space in our framework, where you've got contexts like Iraq, like Somalia, like Yemen, that have been exposed over very long periods of time to extreme fragility. Even within that space, if you look at our analysis over the years, they'll all be in that extreme fragility space consistently. However, we can see some progress. So we can see decreasing fragility, for example, in Iraq, in Somalia, some really interesting examples of progress. So I think we need to be a little bit, again, that's why we don't like labels. We need to be a little bit careful about what we're describing and how we're describing it. But we definitely wouldn't see it as a fragile, non-fragile. As I was saying, it's universal, and there's fragility everywhere.
Yeah.
So this is something I'm obsessing about right now, and on the academic side. So like this is exactly this flow back I talked about before. So I think that if you look at the Lucas critique, right, it says the effect of your policy can be broken by expectation that people have in the moment, or the way they adjust these expectations, right? So you're doing something on the policy side, and people adjust their inflation expectation upwards, and your policy doesn't work. The reverse is also true. So if I'm forecasting something and I share this forecast with you, this could be either a self-fulfilling prophecy or it could be self-defeating prophecy, right? So if I'm having a self-defeating prophecy, then there will be policy responses that will kill my forecast, right? So I go to the FCDO, I say look, there's a problem here and here and here, and they say, oh, let's do something there. Assume they have the right policy tools. And I think this kind of generates, in the outcome data, generates these non-linearities where you have nothing, and then at a sudden, nobody could take care of it, right? And that this poses a massive problem for machine learning models, where the machine is learning from the cases that were realized conflicts. And it doesn't learn from the cases that were prevented. So it will signal to policymakers, don't worry about the situation, this is all under control, because this situation was actually similar to another situation where people, the endogenous policy reaction took care of the forecast that people had, right? So it's super I find it super fascinating. There's no solution to this. As far as I know, I've talked to machine learning people, macroeconomists, right? So in macro, I think it's the closest to this, because we have usually linear equations that we can solve. You can put the policy function back in, and then you can kind of do kind of something. But like if you moment you have a machine learning model and you have like nonlinear responses, I don't know how to. It's a dual causal inference forecasting problem where you need to solve both at the same time, right? Otherwise, you can't solve this problem. You need to have a conditional forecast, like 50% if you do this, 45% if you do this, 30% if you do this, and then you measure all these policies in the past and you subtract them and add them when they took place in the past. That would be the system I propose. I think it's
Tiny values, could follow up.
Yeah.
But that assumes we have no data on the effort that goes into negotiations. Like currently there's this brewing conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia, and we know that there are talks between both sides. But I haven't seen that being used in much.
There's no data on this. No, there's no. I don't think there's data on this, right? Is there? Going back.
It hasn't been collected.
No, I don't think so. Yeah, but I think this is why Blattman is so fascinating, right? I think we all. I mean, I definitely personally buy into this, but I think if you look at paper after paper after paper, the way we model conflict is a Taylor contest function. It has nothing to do with this negotiation, right? There's nothing. It's like, but so even our theoretical tools are not fit for kind of dealing with this, right? And the data side is ahead of us. I think the OECD is exactly this kind of the space becoming smaller for negotiation. That's what you model kind of way with your coping. By the way, it's another thing I like a lot, like on the kind of more forecasting side. That's actually an advice by the Foreign Office team is the inform warning framework. They have this down very well. This whole like from risk to policy response, measuring all the different aspects, going from the entire thing, from like triggers, they call about hazards, these are the exogenous, then to like risk, then to like, you know, this kind of helped me a lot of like making sense of this entire thing where you have the policy response in the end that takes care of the coping and all this kind of stuff, right? And that's perfect, but nobody knows how to measure the entire thing. Like we are all doing like our little, in Spanish you say chapuzas, you know, yeah.
Matteo.
Yeah, a question that is a bit provocative, but is really related to what you asked. So are we talking about preventing conflict? Are we talking about reducing the impact of conflict? And how? I'll give you an example. Like climate change, water, controlling water, floods, and stuff like that. So, of course, you may forecast the probability that you have a certain amount of water. Of course, that you cannot prevent. Let's assume you cannot prevent. But you can organize things in a way that you know is gonna be risky. But then how do you do it? Do you actually intervene heavily, or you allow the population to adjust? You see, traditionally, we didn't have means and tools to build dams, bridges. The local population, I'm talking about my area in northern Italy, they would adjust, they would not build the houses in certain place because they will have recurrent little floods. So they will adjust and put the house in a different place. So that will be intervening, predicting, but the intervention is not really active in the sense of a top down. An alternative is that I know that there is a risk of flood, I build a dam, big dam. 95% of the cases I reduce the flooding probability to 0. But if something goes wrong with the dam, I kill hundreds of thousands of people. So the question is, I see the issue about predictions, because you predict risks like climate, but then what is the philosophy of intervening? You see, ideally, not only you want to intervene, but you want to intervene in which direction? I go back to your point about firm survival. So do we want to prevent conflict, or shall we rather keep conflict at a low scale, sustainable in a way that is feasible, sustainable, adjustable? How do we empower local community in order to do it? You say, and this depends on.
The question is to you, but can I say something?
Of course.
Sorry, because it was also related to, can I be very pessimistic at the same time a bit trying to be inspiring somehow? No,
Of course.
So very confused the point to say, politicians in general, it's not that they don't know the negative effects of conflicts. I've been writing on Palestine conflict a lot, okay? I mean, nobody has read this paper maybe, but still, they were out there, there were calculations, it was clear that there is a negative impact on education, on farm activity, and some, for instance, one of these papers shows that one specific policy implemented by the Israeli government has increased violence in Palestine, okay? So it's not that they don't know, and so we should say it's bad. They know. Unfortunately, there is a lot of other dimension, which is the political one, which is another story. I mean, I'm an economist and I try to look at the economic part of the story. And so my approach is more like the second one. So I assumed that at some point there is a conflict for reasons that probably are understandable, but not really can be explained clearly. So I would be more interested in understanding how to mitigate these effects, what to prioritize, so on which aspect I should invest more. It's education, it's a negative effect on firms and whatever, because I have this idea that unfortunately conflict will explode a bit. I mean, you can try, but still there is an element that is really personal, okay? Sometimes happens something that changes completely the rule of the games and things change. So in this, obviously it's not a competition, okay? It's not like we don't want to do any forecasting or we only focus on the effects. But also understanding the effects is important because there will be always an element of unpredictability of the sources of conflict, and we should be prepared to somehow try to mitigate the effects that will be there anyway. I hope it was not too...
Yes, sir.
Just a couple of thoughts on that, because I think there's a couple of things to say. One is when you say, should we be preventing conflict? Who's we? Because am I, in your example, am I the government of Israel, or am I, a policymaker in a donor country in my capital thinking about my interventions and policies and support options in that context? Those are two completely different scenarios. So I think we need to be a little bit careful about who we is and how, and that'll determine a lot of how the choices are made. And policy making is a choice. It's making choices, it's acknowledging trade-offs, and it is actually, going for the second, third, fourth, fifth best option. How all the ingredients that get, and you were saying, then you get to politics and all the ingredients that come into that when you're making, dare I say, economic policy or infrastructure in a context where there is a simmering conflict. You're driven by many other different factors that are going to come into the mix. So I don't think it's quite as easy of saying, should we be focusing on preventing conflict, or should we focus on managing it? There's probably a little bit of both and many other things thrown in. And again, if I'm at the local community level, then my choices and reactions are going to be different to whether I'm sitting, in a national level policy making position, or indeed in a partner country, donor country, or whatever it is. So I think, many distinctions to make.
Just on I think there's, this work here on the humanitarian response goes exactly to your point, right? So what they are doing, if you look at the humanitarian response and anticipatory action to conflict, they completely focus on natural disasters, because they can predict them, and then they can get people out of the way, and or like ship goods already to the area where the flood will happen, right? And so they are reacting already with a lot of anticipation to lots of crises. There's an amazing project by OCHA, for example, that measures the water upstream, and then they already say, look, we already released the funding now, and 2 months ahead, and so on, right? They don't do anything like that in conflict. And part of the workshop was why? This is really strange. And it's exactly because of the things I said before. Conflict is political, right? And there is a lot of endogeneity of the events to things you do and to things you announce, right? And they need to be politically neutral. OCHA cannot say, oh, we predict right now that whatever, there will, will be this and that happening on the ground, because they might trigger it, and it's a mess, right? And UNHCR, for example, has a quite sophisticated displacement forecasting system running. They don't even share that with the donors, right? Because of course we know what's going on in Europe right now, right? So like UNHCR would be really like foolish to say, oh, by the way, we see this big wave coming from here and this big wave coming from here, right? I think it's exactly what I said before, like the endogeneity of the response of the system to forecasting is a crucial aspect in kind of how you trigger, how you deal with it, how you do the build-up of the system. And so the natural disaster, I don't buy into this. I think we really can prevent conflict. I think not always, right? I assume I'm pivotal always. That's my mental health exercise. But I think that we have to, like paper after paper on the political side shows that if the Pope has a speech, he can bring down conflict. If you bring people to the negotiation table, you can reduce conflict, right? And so it doesn't always work, but I mean that doesn't mean that it never works, right? So I think that we have very clear different cases in terms of natural disasters and armed conflict. I don't think they are the same, like, oh, conflict happens and it's a natural, like kind of like the wildfires in the prairie where they need to happen every now and then. I don't think conflict is like that, right? I think it's Blattman, again, go back to him. I think that's, we most of the time don't have conflict, so it's not a natural thing to have conflicts.
So we have about 2 minutes left for this debate. Are there any questions left from the audience? If not, I think I had a list of things I wanted to talk about. We're not going to cover them all. But perhaps like as a final thought, I would like to talk like very briefly about disciplinary boundaries, because I think like one issue that I faced myself in doing outreach work to policymakers is that they don't necessarily expect economists to talk about issues of conflict, and the same is true actually when we try to engage with the press. Often the press is questioning with what what insights we can bring as economists on themes where political scientists are better recognized, or sociologists as kind of the most kind of relevant and knowledgeable people on these issues. So is there anything we can kind of do to get around that problem, and also how can we work with these other disciplines and make sure that we can offer to policymakers the more holistic approach that they often expect. They typically are interested in kind of putting different pieces of evidence and insights together.
I'm happy to with some thoughts. I think I think it's a huge challenge, and it's one which is not just applicable to research and academia. And although it looks like policymakers are very integrated in their approaches, I think that in reality there's probably as many silos, if I can call them that, in policymaking as there are in other disciplines. And for instance, with the work and I'm looking at Max because my colleague Max is here, he's doing a lot of work on this at the moment, and the work that we do, and it's a little bit what I was saying at the beginning, bringing together the community working on development, so within the development and development space, the community working on fragility and understanding and conflict and sort of analysis and policy responses, with the community working on economic development, is actually, it's a massive challenge. And at the moment we're working towards that. We're getting somewhere, and it's great. But you're putting in the room two sets of experts from the same administrations who are not speaking the same language either. So I mean, my point on language from academia to policy and backwards is valid also within the policy space. So I think the more we can actually create the spaces for the communities to come together and compare notes and understand the added value in the different approaches is really, really important. And so that's why the project that you're taking forwards is critical, because we need to have those spaces to bring the different communities together and to be able to do that translation of beyond the silos.
Yeah, given that time is up, I think we should end on that like positive note. But perhaps also like going back to what Michele said about like, you know, the need to have like evidence on lots of contexts. I think that is also exactly where a program like Recipe you know has potentially a big role to play, because it's I mean the strategy there is exactly to create like lots of research, relatively small grants, but like potentially bringing together evidence from lots of contexts, and like you know, establishing also these dialogues with policymakers. So I'm very hopeful that we'll have these kind of debates going forward as well, and perhaps that in like 2 or 3 years' time, we are like, you know, a bit better informed, hopefully a bit less pessimistic than we are today. But yeah, I want to thank the panelists for this very interesting debate.
Thank you.
Thank you.